So I just want to welcome everybody and thank you all for coming out at such a busy time of the year. This is the season finale of the Buddhist Studies Department, Buddhist Studies year-long lecture series called Putting Pen to Palm Leaf. And my name is Ruth Ozeki, and I'm standing in today for Jay Garfield, who is sadly absent, dealing with a family medical emergency. So Jay has given me the delightful job of introducing Jane, and he's also asked me to say a few words about this series that we're concluding tonight. Putting Pen to Palm Leaf is the second lecture series of its kind organized by the Smith College Buddhist Studies and the Five College Buddhist Studies Consortium. The first of these series was a very successful series called Robed Warriors, which we did 2 years ago. And it was featuring women monastics, women Buddhist monastics who were involved in social justice issues. I think that's a fair summary, isn't it? It attracted audiences from the college community, students, faculty, staff, as well as the general public. So it was a wonderful series, and we decided to reprise it this year with Putting Pen to Palm Leaf, which is a series about Buddhism and contemporary literature. And so we've hosted 4 distinguished writers: Norman Fisher, Leela Kate Wheeler, Jane Hirschfeld, and me. So actually, that makes it 3 distinguished writers and one somewhat more disreputable one. Each of the writers gave a reading, a public lecture, a con seminar, a student seminar, and a 5-college Buddhist faculty seminar. In other words, we worked these poor writers, me, we, to the bone. But the writers have been very gracious and generous with their time, and the series has once again been a wonderful success. A series like this can only come about with the generous support of many, many sponsors, and so I'd like to publicly thank the Office of the President, the Kahn Institute, the College Lecture Committee, the Smith Departments of Religion, English Literature, and Comparative Literature, the Buddhist Studies Program, the Poetry Center, the Ada Howe Kent Fund, and then from the 5 colleges: Amherst College, Department of Religion, Mount Holyoke College, Department of Religion, Hampshire College's School for Critical Social Inquiry, and 5 College Incorporated. So thank you to these generous sponsors for making this possible. We're in the process of planning the next series, which will take place 2 years from now. So if any of our sponsors are here tonight, you will be hearing from us again soon. So now it's my very great pleasure to welcome Jane Hirschfield, and I'm delighted to be introducing her for several very personal reasons. One reason is that, of course, we share a vocation, writing, and a passion for words. Another reason is that we share a lineage, Soto Zen, as transmitted and taught by Shunryu Suzuki, founding abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center. So first, let me tell you a little bit about Jane's vocation. Jane is a prolific writer and the author of, I think, 11 books of poetry. It's a little hard to keep track, Jane.
Never mind.
Yeah, okay. And I think there's a 12th coming out very shortly.
Yeah, but I call it the 9th.
Okay, good. All right. Her work has received many awards and distinctions, including the California Book Award, the Poetry Center Book Award, the Bay Area Book Reviewers Award, and in addition, her books have been shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Jane has also written 2 wonderful books of essays: 9 Gates, Entering the Mind of Poetry, and 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World. She is also a translator and has co-translated the love poems of Ono no Komachi and Izumi Shikibu, 2 Japanese women poets living and writing at the Heian court during the 9th and 10th centuries. These women were famous in Japan. They were counted amongst the 36 poetry immortals, but they were relatively unknown in the rest of the world. Jane's co-translation, which is entitled The Ink Dark Moon, such a beautiful, beautiful title, changed all of that and brought their words back to life in another tongue. As if this weren't enough, Jane has also edited several collections, including Women in Praise of the Sacred, 43 Centuries of Spiritual Poetry by Women. She is a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Academy of American Poets, and the National Endowment for the Arts, among others. And in 2012, she was elected a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. All of this to say that if we here in America had 36 poetry immortals, Jane would certainly be amongst their number. The Polish Nobel Prize poet Czesław Miłosz wrote that in Jane's work he sees, quote, a profound empathy for the suffering of all living beings. It is precisely this I praise in the poetry of Jane Hirschfield. The subject of her poetry is our ordinary life among other people and our continuing encounter with everything earth brings us, trees, flowers, animals, and birds. In its highly sensuous detail, her poetry illuminates the Buddhist virtue of mindfulness. I would add that her work illuminates many other Buddhist virtues and truths as well, the truth of impermanence, of interdependence, of emptiness, of human suffering, and the virtue of courage, of not turning away. But Jane has long resisted the label Zen poet, perhaps for the same reasons that women have long resisted being called women poets or women novelists. I am a human poet, Jane says, that's all. But even so, there is Zen in Jane's work. She was a full-time Zen student for 8 years, starting in 1974, when she was driving to California in a red Dodge van with yellow tie-dyed curtains, and took a detour down a steep, perilous 14-mile dirt road to Tassajara Zen Monastery, where she ended up living as a monk for 3 years. Now, I know that perilous 14-mile dirt road. I was on it 2 weeks ago, driving back up after spending 3 months at that same monastery, waking up at 3:30 in the morning, sitting zazen for hours, chopping gallons of carrots and onions and cabbage, going to bed at 10, too tired to fall asleep. Honestly, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done, and I was only there for 3 months. Jane lived there for 3 years. And that was long before the monastery had heat or electricity. She refers to this time spent in monastic training as the diamond at the center of her life. Whoever I am now, she says, came out of that experience. So who is Jane Hirschfield? Well, according to Lisa Russ Spar, writing for the Chronicle of Higher Education, Jane is a visionary whose work has at its source, quote, the riddle, the existential joke of being, of meaning, of Dickinson's prank of the heart at play on the heart. Spar writes that central to Hirschfield's vision is a kind of holy delight that is at the heart of riddles and koans, the deep pleasure of discovery of the word in or behind or beyond the world, and vice versa. And it's true, Jane's poems exert a strong koan-like hold on the mind and the imagination. They are visionary objects of contemplation that delight you, move you, confound you, and stay with you long after you've read the last word. They are words that enlighten the world. In Nine Gates, Jane writes, immersion in the life of the world, a willingness to be inhabited by and speak for others, including those beyond the realm of the human, these are the practices not just of the bodhisattva, but of the writer. Well, in her practices, Jane embodies both. So it's my great pleasure to give you a true bodhisattva, a writer, a poet, and an American poetry immortal, Jane Hirschfield.
Well, I thank Ruth for that extraordinary introduction, and I will just say, please lower your expectations immediately. I won't repeat the list of gratitudes, but I will say I feel them deeply. I'm very glad to be back here. I will also say that I'm glad this is a more intimate group than last night's poetry reading, because I was wanting this group to be people who I hope are somewhat familiar with Buddhist ideas and terminology, and not just everybody who likes my poems, because one might feel a little lost every once in a while if I use a word and I then don't go ahead and define it. But it can all be looked up or asked afterwards. And I also want to apologize. So I am lifelong. It's not just my stage of life. The woman with no memory. And I had to decide long ago whether I would speak extemporaneously when I give talks like this, and not get all of the particulars quite that I would have intended to, or whether I would give formal talks and write them beforehand. And I was very relieved when I saw one of the founding Zen teachers of America, Eiken Roshi, read his Dharma talk in the Zendo when he came as a guest visitor. And so I take permission that if Eiken Roshi could read a talk in a meditation hall, I can read a talk in a college auditorium. So I will. And here it is. As I was doing the final revisions for this talk, news came of the Sri Lankan Easter Sunday bombings. One more unfathomable act of chosen violence in a line of so many others in so many places beyond counting or naming. Writing a Sri Lankan writer friend, moments after I heard the news, I expressed only my sadness. But then afterwards, I did what I often do and thought, perhaps there is some fuller response. Perhaps there is something more I might want to be thinking now. What would that be? And the first thing that came to mind when I asked myself this question to think and feel a little more fully was the second of the four Buddhist noble truths. Vows, not the truths, the vows. See, that's what happens when I don't look at the paper. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. And then a second thought followed on that one, and what arose surprised me a little. It was the simple wish for some increase of basic humility as an antidote to the psyche's darker energies that drive suffering human beings to such unfathomable acts. And then I began to think about the ideas in Noah Harari's recent book, Sapiens. And Harari proposes that one part of the explanation for our species' evolution into planet-wide dominance over all others is twofold. First, we're a species that's flexible. We have many modes of behavior. And the second is that an immense social power is created by the fact that we are a species who makes up shared fictions. And this shared belief in created stories is what lets human beings take action together in large numbers in those stories' names. Now, one of the stories of Buddhism and Zen is about stepping outside of story, belief, preconception, ideas of self and other, ideas. And still the Dharma comes to us quite often in the form of stories. We cannot help it. We are human, and story is how humans think. When we first put pen to palm leaf, it was to hold the stories by which we parse the world. And yet, as a species, we also have stories' complementary capacity to question. So much of a child's early cognitive work is figuring out the world by questions. What is that? How does it work? Where are we going? When will we get there? Why? 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 By questions, we learn. For questions, we come up with new stories. And so I've always very much liked the traditional image that Buddhist practice rests on a tripod: great effort, great faith, and great doubt. each equally mattering. And I would like to dedicate this talk to doubt and to the hope that we may as a species somehow find our way more fully toward it, that we might surrender some of the coupled energies of pride and humiliation for some increase of simple humility, some allegiance to doubting our own rightness. It's not a very Buddhist concept or word, humility, but it seems to me, for myself at least just now, a useful human space to consider embracing, to take on the practices of humility and the simple modesty of questioning our own stories. A person not sure of their own correctness will not bomb a church or a mosque, a neighbor, a stranger, a school, an ecosystem, a planet. And now I'm going to start this talk the way I was going to start it before last Sunday, with a handful of quotes and, yes, stories. First, in December 1967, during the Shosan question and answer ceremony at Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, the first practice period to be held at the first Zen monastery established in America, a student's question to Shunryu Suzuki Roshi was very basic. Docho Roshi, the student asked, "Who are the Sangha?" Suzuki Roshi answered, "We are. We here in Tassajara are the Sangha, in the limited sense, but really all of us, all sentient beings are Sangha." Second, a Russian interviewer asked the great Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, "What is the purpose of poetry?" Herbert answered, "To wake up." Next, two quotes from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince. "What makes the desert beautiful," said the little prince, "is that somewhere it hides a well." And the second quote, "The eyes are blind. One must learn to look with the heart." And last, the story from which, I don't know if any of you even know the title of this talk. Maybe you just came. The talk has a title, A Branch of Yellow Leaves, Poetry, Buddhism, and the World. So the story that I took that title from, which appears in the Mahayana Buddhist Mahaparinirvana Sutra. A child is weeping inconsolably. Nothing helps. Finally, at wit's end, the parents pick up a branch of bitter willow covered with bright yellow leaves and say, "Here, don't cry. Here is some gold for you." The child stops crying, smiles, and reaches out for the beautiful, bright, shining branches. About this story, Zen Master Rinchi, founder of the Rinzai lineage of Zen, made this comment: "All the teachings of Buddhism are a branch of yellow leaves given to children to stop them from crying." What I want to talk about here is going to be more of a cloud than a single premise or thought. It has something to do with interconnection, compassion, beauty, and transformation. They're inhabitants in our lives and in words. It has something to do with recognizing that the heart-mind's looking is omnipresent and omnidirectional, that liberation from suffering and the desire to wake up are human thirsts that don't come under only the label Buddhist. It has something to do with invisibility and the value of hidden wells, with waters found in expected and unexpected places and ways. It has something to do with beauty's capacity to unbuckle us from our suffering. It has something to do with what is known in Buddhism as upaya, skillful means, and in poetry might be called rhetoric, prosody, craft. It has something to do with the way that the spirit of Zen practice and the practice of poetry and the simple intention to conduct our ordinary lives as aware human beings can, in any moment, join hands. So to enter the cloud, let's pick up from Rinchi's comment. All the teachings are a branch of yellow leaves given to children to stop them from crying. That statement, if it were just taken on its own without any context, might be understood in a multitude of different ways. Taken not on its own with context, it can be understood in a multitude of different ways. So heard one way, it could be heard as an assertion that all teachings are deception and distraction. After all, the origin story of Zen is that it is the teaching outside of words and sutras, transmitted by the silent holding up of a flower. But Linchi's comment might also be heard as meaning something exactly the opposite. It may mean that whatever stops crying and lessens suffering is indeed a teaching. Especially in its original context in the sutra, the parent's actions can also be seen as an example of skillful means, and the story an illustration of Upaya's compassion. The teaching is only effective if it can be heard by its receiver, just as the most beautiful poem would be incomprehensible to us heard in a language we don't know. Parents, child, branch may also be understood as part of a single and larger whole. We ourselves are the parents, the child, the branch. But then we might also stop and think, how does it happen that some bit of offered beauty, a branch of shaken bright leaves, can stop a child from crying? Is it really that the leaves are called gold that stops the crying? I don't think this is a story about instruction in greed, though it could be heard that way. I also don't want to take it as a story about distraction or mistaken concepts, though it could be heard that way too. Perhaps because I am a person on the path of art making, I like to think the word gold is simply a way of saying, look, don't cry, here is some beauty. And to think that offered beauty, the untrained small self whose ceaseless discomfort is an image of dukkha, the suffering named in Buddhism's first noble truth, pauses its wailing. The child is reminded that something in this world exists beyond our personal, this moment grief, and finds the reminder irresistible because of its shining. We cry for one thing, but offered some unexpected beauty outside our own story, stop crying. To call this beauty gold does raise the slippery matter of value. But a willow branch, like a bit of metal, is after all useless to a child. It cannot be eaten. It does not sing to sleep. It is simply something the parents hold out in the spirit of, look, this is better, in a story in which parents are trusted. Perhaps one point of this story is that a branch of this world's rustling golden leaves and a shining nugget of rock in a stream and the gold of awakening Buddha nature are not so different. What that thing is not the point. That the baby stops crying, that is the point. That there is something we might value more than continuing our suffering. Unexpected beauty, we know, does startle us out of our plot points. A bus comes off the Golden Gate Bridge in California and around a curve heading into San Francisco, and through its window you suddenly see a great blue heron. It is literally breathtaking, heart-stopping. Whatever you may have been thinking leaves your mind, which for a moment is entirely only heron. Poems and the practices of Buddhist awareness are herons. They invite us to notice any moment that a few words or the sounds of a pebble striking a piece of bamboo or a bird can break the self open. Such moments remake the self's experience and expectations. Who and what we are changes. Who and what Suzuki Roshi called things as it is changes. When the mind stops spinning stories about this and that, here and elsewhere, self and other, all existence can in that moment be felt as intimate, as Sangha. Now, you see an unexpected city heron, and you want to tell someone about it. Moments of realization and moments of expression do seem to want one another. Here then is another part of the cloud and another story. A 19th century Igloolik Eskimo woman, Uvavnuk, went out one night for the usual reason and was met by the light of a great bolite. She instantly awakened into a different condition of being and returned to her hut as a shaman, singing what would become her lifelong song. The great sea frees me, moves me, as a strong river carries a weed. Earth and her strong winds move me, take me away, and my soul is swept up in joy. I think many in this room will recognize, even in the diminished form of an English translation, the thrown openness, liberation, and boundless sense of connection that Uvavnuk describes. Her poem's images of earth and sea and wind bring to mind for me the image and story of the historical Buddha's gesture of touching the earth. In some tellings, in that moment, the earth itself speaks, proclaiming itself witness to the truth of his awakening. In some tellings, the Buddha then sees the morning star and says, "Now I and all things awaken together." 2 days ago was Earth Day, a reminder of all beings' interconnection. It matters that realms beyond the human are included in what we think matters, that awakening isn't for some people or some beings, it is everyone's awakening, everything's awakening. We care for the future of what is included when we say the pronoun we. And so it matters also that we recognize that liberation and awakening don't belong to any one path or tradition. They are Uvavnuk's. They are Zbigniew Herbert's, who wanted poetry that wakes up. Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince knows that any desert holds its hidden wells for the heart that can see. And seen, they are sung. The Aboriginal dream songs of Australia are maps not least to hidden water. Knowledge found wants to be kept, and so experiences of awakening and freedom do seem very often to lead to poems. Something in us feels often, not always, but often, that what is beyond words still can be pointed to by them, held in them, created by them, as it is in this famous haiku by Basho. Old pond, frog leap, splash. The poem read superficially might seem like almost nothing, a mere description. Read with fully open ears, eyes, heart, mind, its few words can be felt as the light of a life-changing bolite. Basho's poem doesn't describe, it enacts an entrance into this moment's thusness. When we become pond, frog, and water sound all at once, every limited idea of the self breaks open. We know our lives as not only what sits inside one body, dry, outside ponds. As I talked about at yesterday's question and answer, which some very few of you were also at, I think, good poetry works to wake up by carrying us from one way of being into another. Any good poem invites and creates some changed understanding. That is what makes it, at least for me, good. Part of how it does this is by poetry's and art's and the psyche's own skillful means. Beauty works first by releasing us from the status quo of a moment, of a life. To take it in at all, a person must first become permeable, vulnerable to the presence of something new. We step out of the separation of self and other. What Basho saw and heard and felt, we now, in this moment, see and hear and feel. You can't understand what the words old pond mean without becoming for a moment that quiet, long-standing pool of water, and all water means within both the archetypes of the psyche and the ordinary experienced day. You cannot comprehend the words frog leap without feeling it in your own thighs, Neuroscience confirms this. When we read of a leaping frog, the brain's motor cortex engages. And then the sound of water, which is the literal of the Japanese phrase I've given here as splash. But in Japanese, it has onomatopoetic, and it sounds like what it's talking about. So in English, we have to go with splash. That moment, that splash, is the felt entrance when the changeless and the changing intersect in the reader's whole body and mind. So this erasure of status quo and transformation of self, it happens in all poems, I firmly believe, not only in poems by people like Basho, who does have both a biographical and an aesthetic connection to the practices and understanding of Zen. Homer, Sappho, Wordsworth all work by the same warmth of interconnection, by the same dissolving of fixed boundaries and undoing of separation. A bird in any poem is the actual blackbird, owl, mountain cuckoo. It's also your own experience of birds, of singing, of flight swiftness, of landing within and outside the self. A mountain in a poem is both the shaped and actual uplifted rock of the earth's mantle and your own interior life of steepness, stillness, precipice, persistence, stoneness. Meeting an image, our lives and the thing we read of become for a moment one, not self, not other. So I've chosen almost arbitrarily 3 poems to read you that speak to our inner and outer stone nature. The first one is the poet Charles Simick's very well-known Stone. Go inside a stone. That would be my way. Let somebody else become a dove or gnash with a tiger's tooth. I am happy to be a stone. From the outside, the stone is a riddle. No one knows how to answer it. Yet within, it must be cool and quiet, even though a cow steps on it full weight, even though a child throws it in a river. The stone sinks, slow, unperturbed to the river bottom, where the fishes come to knock on it and listen. I have seen sparks fly out when 2 stones are rubbed. So perhaps it is not dark inside after all. Perhaps there is a moon shining from somewhere, as though behind a hill. Just enough light to make out the strange writings, the star charts on the inner walls. The second poem, Black Stone Lying on a White Stone by Cesar Vallejo. I will die in Paris on a rainy day, on some day I can already remember. I will die in Paris, and I don't step aside, perhaps on a Thursday, as today is Thursday in autumn. It will be a Thursday because today, Thursday, setting down these lines, I have put my upper arm bones on wrong, and never so much as today have I found myself with all the road ahead of me, alone. Cesar Vallejo is dead. Everyone beat him. Although he never does anything to them, they beat him hard with a stick and hard also with a rope. These are the witnesses, the Thursdays and the bones of my arms, the solitude and the rain and the roads. And the third one, another haiku by Basho. Stillness, a cicada's cry drills into the rock. These 3 poems are different in speaking, in texture, in feeling. Vallejo's stones appear only in his mysteriously perfect title. Simick makes of his stone a surreal narrative of interior exploration. In Basho's haiku, the rock is perhaps most actual. It is like his previous haikus, Old Pond also, however. Both the outer world's visible granite or basalt are also shunyata, entered by the crickets' brief singing, spoken in words that lead us to glimpse these as inseparable from one another. There's nothing Buddhist sounding in the poems of Simic or Vallejo, and that is part of my point here, that I'm not talking only about a certain kind of poem. I could have chosen any image, any type of poetry. Move from poet to poet, poem to poem, point of study to point of study. In each case, an experience familiar to us from Zen appears. Taking in a noun or verb, self drops away. We become, for a moment, however fleeting, stoneness, ropeness, cicada. And this stoneness, we find, while within it, is not inert or limited. It is an expansion of being, of freedom, of possibility. Like Charles Simic, we find ourselves moving freely within it. We find ourselves discovering new writing, hidden charts of navigation. For a poet born as he was in Belgrade in 1938, I will add, who lived through the Second World War as a child, to find new ways of being in the face of granitic circumstance might be guessed a necessity for preserving aliveness. There is no human being, though, who doesn't at some point feel themselves facing something impenetrable, who doesn't need to find that what cannot be escaped can still be entered. Reading each of these poems, I feel some measure of Uvavnik's sheer exhilaration, her augmented aliveness. Freedom accompanies whatever other emotions a poem may hold. We become Vallejo's rain and bones, Simic's fishes, Basho's singing insect. We become the poem's punctuation and pauses, its vowels and consonants, its music. The poet's breathing becomes our breathing inside their words. By these intimate, small accumulations of enterings and transformation, poems come to function in our lives as life rafts, as antidotes to isolation and depression. Entering even another person's suffering inside a good poem, our own suffering is stepped outside of, recalibrated, sometimes forgotten. We are reminded that we are not alone in whatever we ourselves feel, and we are reminded that within any experience, any emotion, an original response can be found, one that restores some sense of malleability, resilience, agency. A Peruvian poet in exile, as Vallejo was, born in a remote Andean village, describes himself as having been beaten all his life by an uncaring word with sticks, with ropes, and still, contemplating even his own future death, finds a kind of exuberant authority in the describing. I have put my upper arm bones on wrong, and never so much as today have I found myself with all the road ahead of me, alone. Writer and reader are restored to the sense of this person as a maker, not only victim. We can know ourselves not passive before what happens. The lines hold immense grief, but they hold also the recognizable signature of the artist, a person larger than the grief he describes. They hold freedom. Images in a poem ask us to become one with what they evoke, and so remind us that we are not separate beings. We are continuous with the non-Charles, non-Cesar, non-Basho world, and it in turn is continuous with us. Nothing human is alien to me, wrote the 2nd century BCE Roman playwright Terence. A Zen equivalent to that thought might be simply, not one, not two. In poetry, nothing in existence is alien to writer, to reader. And more, everything in existence is made malleable. Whatever is fixed in us becomes open to change emotionally, intellectually, experientially. And that transformation softens and warms what has become set in our ways and comprehensions. This is true also of meditation practice, and this is one of the cloud things I'm trying to say today. how both of these ways of working with self and world and inhabiting a moment move us from small self to large self. Kafka famously described it: literature is an axe that breaks open the frozen sea inside of us. That sounds to me a lot like a description of Kensho. We also need art to carry what cannot be grasped and yet can be conveyed. In the traditions of Zen and other Buddhist poetry, this is explicit. Snow in a silver bowl, the moon in a dewdrop, the green mountains are always walking, a stone woman gives birth to a child in the night. The capping verses of koan collections, the Pali Therigatha and Therigatha poems of the early nuns and monks, hold accounts of awakening. In other literature, the elusive awakening may seem less direct, and yet I've always loved the poet Galway Kinnell's suggestion that the secret title of every good poem might be tenderness. An aquifer of compassion runs under all good poems, and it appears in the recognition that one person's suffering is everyone's suffering, that one phrase's finding of freedom is everyone's increase of freedom. Imagination, beauty, unliteral meaning, all are expansions of the possible augmenting awareness we find also in Zazen. I don't need to say to anyone who would come to a talk like this at all how much of contemporary life seems designed to blunt, to dull, to distract rather than awaken. I've heard it said that across the globe, young people now spend more of their free time playing video games than they do any other way, even surfing the web or doing social media or listening to music. And to play a game is to enter a story, a highly seductive narrative designed to lessen larger awareness. The awareness, for instance, that violence is violence, actual and painful, or that a win-lose, zero-sum frame of understanding is not the only way to know our relationships to one another. The awareness of game playing is pretty much the opposite of Buddhist practice mind of doubt, the practice mind of poetry's multiple possibilities. There is just no time for questioning any given game's given premises. And if what humans do on this planet is created by our stories, what is the story, in Noah Harari's terms, that video game playing teaches? And what is the story that meditation or art making teaches? I tried, but I couldn't think of any poem that has the structure of a video game in these dimensions. Even the poems that are riddles are about the pleasures of complication and of multiple meanings. No one wins or loses a poem. And a video game, I didn't want to be so mean about video games, and I will say they do perhaps instruct in strategic thinking and hone certain kinds of concentration. And all play is a human good. Play is good. But maybe not to be so hypnotizing that it crowds out the desire for enlarging contemplation or the awareness of what might be missing from a life in a deeper way. A good poem, like meditation, invites a concentration that is open, not narrow, plotline closed, and it wants to drink from Saint-Exupéry's hidden wells, inexhaustible, inextricable from even the desert's beauty. So I'm coming now to the last part of this cloud, and I am going to do something I almost never do and speak a tiny bit more personally, not very personally, but a little tiny bit more, and some of it you heard Ruth referring to. My earliest entrance, but you didn't hear all of it, some of it. My earliest entrance into Buddhism came from poetry's images. The first book I bought with my own money when I was 7 or 8 was a Peter Popper Press collection of Japanese haiku. And I cannot guess now what I might have parsed at that age from those poems or their meanings. but I certainly knew there was something in them I wanted in my own life. And later in high school, certain words of Wordsworth, Emerson, and Thoreau, they became branches of yellow leaves. And the poems of Horace that I could read at that time in Latin, and some of the early Imagist poems of Pound and Williams. In 10th grade, on an entirely incidental school outing, I was taught Zazen one afternoon by the young Japanese priest who would later become known as Edo Roshi. A few years after that, in college, I began to sit on my own, and I very foolishly dropped out of a Mahayana Buddhism course being taught by Bill LaFleur. I know. I didn't know that 2 years later I would be driving over a mountain dirt 14-mile road to Tassajara to begin years of formal full-time training in Soto Zen. But I did at least take every East Asian studies class there was in Japanese and Chinese literature in translation. And I went to the East Asian Studies coffee hour at which Gary Snyder described the Yamabushi mountain monks and their precipice practice. Gary was the first American Zen practitioner I'd seen. Ponytail, earrings, twinkling eyes, a poet who'd done trail work and wrote love poems along with translating the work of the ancient masters. That Gary looked like anyone else, that he was an American person writing fully American poems, made a gate that I still walk through. I didn't know at the time that the gate of nothing special is also part of the tradition, that Zen is not about anything exotic. It is only the taste of your own tongue in your own mouth. So I hope everyone here is familiar with the 10 ox herding pictures of Zen. If you aren't, you can Google them. It's a set of images and accompanying poems originating in the 11th century, depicting the practices, the stages of practice and understanding. The final 10th picture and poem describe a return to the ordinary world. The ox herder looks like any other ox herder, walking with his quiet bull into the marketplace, going forward with what seem to be ordinary human engagements. He doesn't look like a bodhisattva. The image just shows a person simply helping others outside of specialized buildings, schedules, clothes. Just a person buying or selling groceries in a way that quietly lessens suffering, while nearby trees break into spring blossom and the first bees of the year gather nectar for honey, not thinking about pollinating the trees as they go on with their own lives and tasks. Just that's how the world has evolved to flourish. When I first arrived at Tassajara, I was only allowed to stay a week as a summer guest student, and after that, I had to go to the city center in San Francisco for a year to learn how to cross my legs and sit still and eat and all those basic things before I then could re-enter Tassajara for 3 years of the much stricter winter monastic practice. But it was during those very first few months at Page Street that I heard in an informal talk another description that struck me the way Gary had struck me, in a way that became a lasting gate. And it was a description of 4 possible modes of practicing Zen. One is monastic practice. One is the temple practice of a priest. One is layperson practice, in which a person combines an ordinary-looking life with still being part of a sangha and having a formal relationship with the teacher. And the 4th was called tea house practice, a practice that can hardly be outwardly recognized as practice at all. You just pour tea, wipe the counter, greet your customers when they enter, and people, without knowing why, just kind of like to go to that particular tea house. And the idea of tea house practice seemed to me a good fit with American life. It was Gary Snyder looking like anyone else walking around a college campus. And it also, I realized quite a long time later, chimed with the stories I'd encountered in those East Asian Studies classes in a no play about the 9th century Japanese woman poet Ono Komachi. So Komachi was considered the greatest poet and the most beautiful woman of her age. And I learned again, many years later when I actually was working on the Ink Dark Moon, I realized being the greatest poet made you the most beautiful woman of your age. It wasn't about bone structure. And in the No Plays, Komachi is shown ending her life as an unrecognized 100-year-old half-mad hag living in a thatch-roofed hut outside the walls of Kyoto. But still writing poetry and still wise in the ways of Buddhist understanding. And one 14th century no play based on her legend, Sotoba Komachi, has pretty much stayed a lifetime teaching for me. And I'm not going to take the time to tell you the story here, but if you want easy access to it, a lot of it is excerpted, and the basic story is told in the last chapter of my Nine Gates book. And her poems are very available to you in the Ink Dark Moon as well. So it didn't occur to me until many years after I had embraced both this proto-feminist, unrecognized old poet practicing on the paths and trouncing Buddhist monks in Dharma combat when she sat on the wrong stump as far as they were concerned. And then the tea house practice idea, it didn't ever occur to me that both of those are stories about women. And I was a very young, committed feminist, and I don't think I quite realized how closed off the regular paths of practice had been, because I wanted to believe that every path was open. So here is, in Yogen Senzaki and Paul Repp's words, the story of where the idea of tea house practice comes from. It's from a koan called The Old Woman and the Fire Poker. Master Hakuin Ekaku used to tell his students about an old woman who had a tea shop nearby, praising her understanding of Zen. The students didn't believe that such a person could have much wisdom, and so they would go to the tea shop to find out for themselves. Whenever the woman saw them coming, she could tell at once whether they had come for tea or to look into her grasp of Zen. In the former case, she served them graciously. In the latter, she beckoned them to come behind the screen to the back of the tea shop. The instant they obeyed, she hit them with a fire poker. So this unrecognized teacher is a hidden well outside the gate of any visible temple. Her authority is hidden as well. Her abbot's stick is an ordinary fire poker tucked behind her shop's rice paper screen. And I hope nobody here is too shocked by the beating part of this. You're probably really familiar. All the old Zen stories have a great deal of hitting and striking in them. And I know that my Buddhist community now has given up the stick. But when I was there, it was carried every single period of Zazen, and I truly understood it as a generous offering and not something abusive, even though my tiny, bony shoulders, if I ever was hit with the stick, would hurt for 2 weeks. But, this is a thing. Conceptions change, and people at Zen Center said that it was awakening trauma for them, and the stick was, as far as I know, stopped. And so I'm just going to ask for this few minutes that we set aside the fact that we have changed conceptions about these things, not least because the tea house story is about changing conceptions and about how preconceptions lead to blinded eyes and not Saint-Exupéry's seeing heart. One preconception in the story is surely gender. These monks were skeptical of the practice of a woman. Another is status. The monks have taken vows. They are official, visible home leavers in their black robes. And the old woman, you may echo here the 10th ox herding picture, she lives in the world of commerce and thirst, of road dust and fatigue. how the monks think could her understanding, rooted in that ordinary distracted life in which they, of course, were part of the distraction, how could her practice compare to their own long effort and strict meditation? She might as well have been a video game player in their eyes. But for those who are not ambitious, skeptical, or competitive, for those with simple, genuine thirst, no fire poker comes. The old woman just pours hot water over fragrant green leaves, then wipes the counter with her clean cloth. And Hakuin up the road, who may be an abbot, but is not blinded by his own status or robes, knows her for who she is, and sends his students to her for testing and ripening. A person of no rank, reaching back in sleep for a pillow. Throughout Zen, we find realization described in such images as a mountain whose grasses any donkey can browse. What is Buddha? One student asks. The teacher replies, have you eaten your breakfast? Yes. Then wash your bowl. When I left my years of formal training in Zen and began to make my way as a poet, I didn't hide my background in practice, but I didn't announce it. I didn't want my poems hung on a Buddhist coat peg or read with any pre-existing expectation of what they might mean. They have fewer explicit mentions of Buddhism than the poems of many people who have never sat on a zafu. And I do want them to be read only as human poems coming from only a human life. And as I've been saying throughout this talk, that's also kind of how I want my own practice as well. And this is no disrespect to the other three paths. I honor them. I treasure the fact that I had the opportunity to live in that strict monastery, in robes, in that schedule. But I also value the fact that Buddhism offers the tea house practice path. And so, I like the idea that the Dharma can be found anywhere. Looks like nothing special. And then in 1999, Bill Moyers was interviewing me for a television special. And suddenly on camera, I found him asking me, I've heard that in Zen you do something called tea house practice. What does that mean? And all I could do was blink and say, it means you've just burned down my tea house. But my poems still do tea house practice, even if I, standing here in front of you talking in a Buddhist Studies program series, cannot anymore. So I'm going to end with one last small story. I was once on the phone with a friend who said that he'd just been offered a contract to write a book about Buddhism. And he said, all Buddhism, and they're only giving me 40,000 words. And I just sort of heard myself answer, only 40,000 words. Whoa, that's either way too few or it's way too many. And he said, what do you mean way too many? And I'd never thought about any of this before, but out of my mouth I heard the words coming, well, you only need 7. And then he, of course, asked the obvious thing, what are they? And out of my mouth I heard 7 words emerge, correctly counted, which was, I just said, all you need, everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention. And later on, I had the chance to think about, did I think that was correct? And I can work it out. I could go through and say why I think that the ideas of compassion and as well as impermanence, how these can all be found in these 7 words. And they kind of caught on. I taught them to one of my workshops at Tassajara, and one of the students said, can I make a t-shirt of that? And now they've been inscribed in 2 permanently installed sculptures, one in Washington State and one in Milwaukee. But I realized after a while that you only need 2. You only need pay attention. Because if you pay attention, you will see that everything is connected and everything changes. And so that's just where I'm going to leave us tonight, that pay attention. And if we do, if we can, if we want to, if we choose that, maybe we will be able to look around us and find some branches of yellow leaves to lessen this world's inconsolable crying. Thank you. I don't mind answering a few questions. It can only be a little bit longer because I have something else on the schedule pretty soon. Yes, they do run us, as Ruth said. But I would be very happy if anyone has one. Raise your hand really fast. Yes.
Just one minor question. The four different types of practice, traditional monastic practice, lay practice, tea house practice. What was the
Temple priest. Yeah. You're welcome. That was easy. Anybody got anything that's easy? If I was an auctioneer, I'd going once, going twice. Yes.
How did you decide to leave the monastery and be a poet?
Yeah, so I was writing throughout my childhood, and when I drove west in that red Dodge van with tie-dyed curtains, what I thought I was doing was looking for a nice place to live, be a waitress, and write poems. But I knew this one monastery existed, and I was curious, and I just went to look at it. I had no idea I was going to enter practice so seriously for so long. And I think that buried seed of the tea house practice and lay practice as being complete and viable ways allowed me to really go into this. I felt two things. One was I felt like I was never going to be any good at anything I tried to do in the world if I didn't do this practice first. I knew that I was a timid person who didn't know how to stay inside her own experience and face it, or what to do if the dragon's roar came over one. And so I simply knew I had to do this. And then I also felt, when I entered the monastery, the rule then was so strict, people weren't even allowed to do yoga. It was nothing but this practice. And so I knew I knew 3 years was at that time the longest anybody had stayed at Tassajara. Now, some people who entered with me stayed on, but up until that time, 3 years was sort of the traditional 1,000 days maximum of it's not like a Catholic monastery where you go for life. And I simply realized as I, entered and knew that I wasn't going to write a poem for 3 years, I broke the rule once. I was having coffee before Zazen on the front deck of my hill cabin, and I wrote a haiku about the stars. That was it, 3 lines in 3 years. It just walloped me. Can I recite it? Tonight the trees are hung with stars, implausible poems undone by morning. I think that's it. So I was perfectly prepared for never to be a poet. But when I left the monastery and I was practicing under the less stringent rules of Green Gulch, the third of Zen Center's places, poems began coming back. And Zen Center was very kind, and I never went to graduate school, but there was an adult ed course at UC Berkeley that was really good, and they let me sleep in the next morning so I could go to this night class. And just very, very gradually, my life went so that on weekends I was a full-time cook at Green's Restaurant, owned by Zen Center in San Francisco, and in weekdays I was starting to teach poets in the schools, in the elementary schools of my hometown, and it just very gradually evolved. But I'm sure the comfort of that for me was partly made by this idea that lay practice and tea house practice are complete. I wasn't giving anything up. I was simply practicing within the image of Ono no Kamachi. Not too bad, and if my roof was going to leak, well then, let it leak. Yes.
And it's 10 words, not 7. It really is the essence, and those 10 words are that you came to love it. That was the gift. And I just want to say publicly thank you.
Oh.
Because I feel like if I could snap those words, to love it, anything, everything, then it always be good.
I thank you very much for that. Yes.
Is about an analogy that I don't know if it's correct, but the 4 paths being very disciplined, and then the tea shop path being a little bit less well-defined and shaped. And I love your life. It's sort of what I'm doing in a
Mm-hmm.
way, and I'm wondering if you, what relationship would be for being really blowing it, being a trained poet versus just writing in that free spirit.
Ah, I understand your question.
Feel validated, and
Mm-hmm.
thinking it doesn't matter if
Mm-hmm.
you're happy with what you're writing.
So here is, I think, the element that might be missing from your. Could people hear the question? The 4 different paths, very disciplined, outward-looking, and not so disciplined looking. The tea house practice, and I think the link that makes them equally valid is that they are, all of them in their different expressions, built on the intention of complete awareness. And so the old lady in the tea house might not be getting up at 3:40 in the morning and going to sit for 6 hours, but when she pours the tea, she does it with 100% mindfulness. And that is true for the writing of poetry as well. Poetry is a tool, just like Zazen is, for increasing awareness. It's not that we're born with complete awareness, and it's not like we ever arrive at complete awareness, but the practice of being alert to the difference between the article "the window" and saying "a window," that is a complete practice of awareness. And we do it whether we are consciously cultivating it or simply without even thinking about it, going, I think it should be a window and not the window. That's crossing your legs and sitting down for 6 hours. You're welcome. You're welcome. So maybe that's a good note to close on. I know some of you are continuing on to the next event and some of you aren't. Thank you so much for giving me your ears and time and attention tonight. Thank you.